December 19th, 1944. The Ardennes forest. Snow fell in thick, silent curtains as American soldiers huddled in frozen farmhouses. Unaware they stood in the path of Hitler's last desperate gamble, the Battle of the Bulge. 70 miles south, General George Patton sat in his command post as tank engines rumbled through Nancy's cobblestone streets. His Third Army was preparing the impossible: pivot 90 degrees and drive north through winter storms to relieve encircled forces at Bastogne. The orders had been given, and Patton had not waited for permission. This audacious move would save thousands of American lives and halt Hitler's final offensive. But it would also ignite a firestorm between the cautious British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who valued discipline and coalition unity, and the American warhorse who answered to no one when battle called. What Churchill said when he learned of Patton's unauthorized movement would reveal the deepest truths about democratic warfare, the burden of coalition leadership, and whether audacity or coordination wins wars. This is the story of the 48 hours that changed World War II, and the words spoken between two titans that defined the alliance which defeated Nazi tyranny. December 19th, 1944. The Ardennes forest. Snow fell in thick, silent curtains across the Belgian hills, blanketing the frosted pines and turning the narrow roads into treacherous ribbons of ice. The air smelled of wood smoke and diesel exhaust, mixed with the acrid bite of cordite drifting from the front lines. In farmhouses and village cellars across the region, American soldiers huddled against the cold, their breath forming ghostly plumes in the darkness. They did not yet know that they were standing in the path of Hitler's last great gamble, a massive armored thrust that would come to be known as the Battle of the Bulge. And they did not know that salvation would come not from the careful deliberations of Allied commanders in their heated war rooms, but from the audacious defiance of one man, General George Smith Patton, Jr. 70 miles to the south, in the ancient fortress city of Nancy, France, Patton sat in a stone-walled command post that had once housed Napoleonic officers. Maps covered every surface. Radio operators worked their sets with urgent precision. Outside, the rumble of tank engines and the grinding of treads against cobblestone streets created a mechanical symphony that never ceased. Patton's Third Army, battle-hardened, relentless, and forged in the crucible of the European campaign, was preparing to do the impossible. They were about to pivot 90 degrees, abandon their current offensive toward the German industrial heartland, and drive north through winter storms to relieve the encircled American forces in Bastogne. The decision had been made. The orders had been given, and Patton had not waited for permission. This was not the way wars were supposed to be fought in 1944. The Allied command structure was a careful hierarchy of British and American generals, each movement coordinated through Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force under General Dwight Eisenhower. Decisions of strategic magnitude required consultation, consensus, and the delicate balancing of national pride and military necessity. The British Commonwealth forces, led in spirit if not always in direct command by Prime Minister Winston Churchill, had been fighting since 1939. They had endured Dunkirk, the Blitz, the desert campaigns of North Africa. They had learned to you through bitter experience the cost of rash decisions and uncoordinated action. The Americans, despite their industrial might and growing battlefield prowess, were still viewed by some British commanders as impetuous newcomers to the ancient art of European warfare. And George Patton embodied every British fear about American impetuousness, multiplied tenfold. Yet on that frozen December evening, as German panzers rolled westward through gaps in the American lines, and the outcome of the entire war suddenly hung in precarious balance, it was Patton's impetuousness that would prove decisive. His willingness to act without waiting, to move first and explain later, to trust his instinct and his soldiers over the cautious deliberations of coalition warfare. This would save thousands of American lives and halt Hitler's final offensive. But it would also create a moment of profound tension between the two great leaders of the Western Alliance, the British Lion, Winston Churchill, and the American warhorse who answered to no one when battle called. What Churchill said when he learned of Patton's unauthorized movement would reveal not just the friction between Allied commands, but something deeper about the nature of democratic warfare, the burden of coalition leadership, and the terrible calculus of balancing military necessity against political unity. The words spoken in those December days would echo through the horrors core of history, a testament to both the strength and the fragility of the alliance that defeated Nazi tyranny. To understand the magnitude of Patton's decision, one must first comprehend the military situation in December 1944. and the rigid command structure that governed Allied operations. By autumn of that year, the advance across France had slowed. The exhilarating breakout from Normandy, the liberation of Paris, the race across the Seine, all of this had given way to the grinding reality of fighting toward Germany's industrial core. Supply lines stretched to breaking. Fuel shortages plagued armored divisions. The German army, though battered and bleeding, fought with desperate ferocity on its own soil. The war that many had hoped would end by Christmas 1944 now seemed destined to drag into 1945. The Allied command structure reflected the political complexity of the coalition. Eisenhower, as Supreme Commander, bore ultimate responsibility, but he commanded British, Canadian, American, French, and Polish forces, each with its own command traditions, national sensitivities, and political masters to satisfy. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery commanded the 21st Army Group, consisting primarily of British and Canadian forces. In the northern sector, General Omar Bradley commanded the 12th Army Group, consisting of American forces in the center and south. Under Bradley's command, Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges led the 1st Army in the north, Lieutenant General William Simpson led the 9th Army, and Lieutenant General George Patton led the 3rd Army in the south. Every major operational decision flowed upward through this hierarchy, was debated at SHAEF headquarters, and coordinated to ensure that British and American efforts complemented rather than conflicted with each other. This structure was necessary. It prevented the wasteful duplication of effort. It ensured that limited resources, ammunition, fuel, bridging equipment, air support, were allocated according to strategic priorities rather than the ambitions of individual commanders. It maintained the political unity that was itself a weapon against Nazi propaganda, which constantly predicted the collapse of the unnatural alliance between the capitalist democracies. But this structure also imposed delay. Decisions that a single national command could make in hours might take days in a coalition framework, and delay in warfare was measured in blood. Patton had always chafed against this restraint. His conception of warfare was fundamentally offensive, aggressive, predicated on speed and shock. He had studied the campaigns of Hannibal, Napoleon, and Stonewall Jackson. He believed in the decisive power of rapid maneuver, in striking the enemy where he was weak rather than battering against his strength. During the drive across France, Patton's 3rd Army had advanced faster and farther than any army in modern warfare, covering distances in days that would have taken weeks in the previous war. But this success came at a cost that troubled the methodical planners at SHAEF. Patton frequently ignored orders, diverted fuel meant for other units, exceeded his operational boundaries, and justified his insubordination only through results. To Eisenhower, he was a brilliant but exhausting subordinate who required constant supervision. To Bradley, his immediate superior, he was a double-edged sword, devastatingly effective, but potentially catastrophic. To Montgomery and the British command, he was the embodiment of American recklessness, a man whose tactical genius could not excuse his disregard for the disciplines of coalition warfare. Yet, Patton understood something that the planners sometimes forgot. That war, at its core, was not an administrative exercise, but a contest of human will. The side that imposed its will upon the enemy, that moved faster, struck harder, refused to be paralyzed by uncertainty, that side would prevail. And in December 1944, as German forces launched their surprise offensive through the Ardennes, it was precisely this quality of decisive will that the Allied cause desperately needed. The German attack began on December 16, 1944. In the pre-dawn darkness, artillery fire erupted along an 80-mile front in the forested, mountainous Ardennes region. It was the same ground through which German armies had struck in 1914 and 1940, terrain that Allied planners had deemed unsuitable for major offensive operations, and had therefore defended lightly. Hitler had gambled everything on this final throw of the dice. If his armies could break through the American lines, cross the Meuse River, and capture the vital port of Antwerp, they might split the Allied forces in two, encircle and destroy Montgomery's northern armies, and force the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace. It was a fantasy born of desperation, but in the first days of the offensive, it seemed terrifyingly possible. German panzer divisions, supported by elite Volksgrenadier infantry, smashed into the thinly held American positions. Fog and snow grounded Allied aircraft, neutralizing the overwhelming air superiority that had become the Allies' decisive advantage. American units, many of them inexperienced divisions sent to this quiet sector for rest and training, found themselves surrounded and fighting for survival. Communication broke down. Headquarters lost contact with forward units. Confusion reigned. By December 19th, German forces had advanced up to 50 miles in some sectors, creating a massive bulge in the Allied lines, hence the battle's name. At the town of Bastogne, a critical road junction, the 101st Airborne Division and elements of other units found themselves encircled, holding a position that both sides recognized as strategically vital. If Bastogne fell, the German advance could continue. If it held, the entire offensive might stall. The crisis demanded immediate response, but the Allied command structure was scattered and initially paralyzed. Eisenhower was at Versailles. Montgomery was at his headquarters in Belgium. Bradley was at Luxembourg. Patton was at Nancy, prosecuting his own offensive toward the Saar region and the German industrial heartland. On December 19th, Eisenhower convened an emergency meeting at Verdun, that ancient fortress city where French armies had bled the German forces white in 1916, a name that carried the weight of history and sacrifice. The mood in the conference room was grim. Officers studied maps showing the German penetration, the surrounded American units, the threatened supply lines. Eisenhower, normally calm and deliberate, was clearly shaken by the speed and ferocity of the German attack. He told his assembled commanders that this was not a disaster, but an opportunity. The Germans had come out of their fixed defenses and were now vulnerable to counterattack. But who could counterattack, and how quickly? Eisenhower turned to Patton. The question was direct. How soon could Third Army disengage from its current offensive, pivot 90 degrees to the north, and attack into the southern flank of the German Bulge? It was a military maneuver of extraordinary difficulty. Patton's forces were spread across a wide front, engaged in heavy combat. To disengage, reorient, and attack in a new direction would normally require weeks of preparation, pulling units out of line, moving supplies, coordinating with adjacent forces, planning routes and objectives. Every officer in that room understood the complexity. Patton's answer shocked them: 48 hours. Within 2 days, he promised, 3 divisions of Third Army would be attacking northward to relieve Bastogne. The other generals exchanged glances. Some thought he was bluffing, trying to impress Eisenhower with impossible promises. Others thought he was reckless, underestimating the logistical nightmare of such a maneuver. Even Bradley, who knew Patton best, was skeptical. But Eisenhower, desperate for decisive action, authorized the movement. Patton saluted and left the room immediately. What none of them knew, what Patton revealed only later, was that he had already begun the maneuver. Days before the Verdun Conference, as reports of the German offensive filtered south, Patton had ordered his staff to prepare contingency plans for exactly this scenario. He had pulled units out of line, repositioned supplies, alerted division commanders. When Eisenhower asked how soon he could move, Patton was not making a promise about the future. He was describing preparations already underway. He had acted without authorization, without informing his superiors, based solely on his tactical judgment that Third Army would be needed in the north. It was a staggering breach of military protocol. It was also exactly what the situation demanded. Within hours of leaving Verdun, Patton's forces were on the move. The 4th Armored Division, the 26th Infantry Division, and the 80th Infantry Division, 133,000 men, 15,000 vehicles, hundreds of tanks, began a 90-degree pivot in the middle of winter through snow and ice, over narrow Belgian roads, never designed for mechanized armies. It was a logistical miracle and a command achievement that military historians would study for generations. Supply officers worked through the night, redirecting fuel and ammunition convoys. Engineers cleared roads and erected temporary bridges. Division commanders navigated by compass and dead reckoning, their columns stretching for miles through the darkness. And at the head of this massive reorientation, driving forward in his command vehicle, was Patton himself, radiating the absolute certainty that his army would accomplish the impossible because he expected nothing less. By December 22nd, elements of Third Army were engaging German forces on the southern flank of the Bulge. By December 26th, the 4th Armored Division broke through to Bastogne, ending the siege and securing the road junction. The German offensive, which had depended on speed and disruption, began to lose momentum. Patton's attack had not merely relieved one surrounded garrison, it had fundamentally altered the operational calculus of the entire battle. The Germans, instead of exploiting westward toward the Meuse, now had to commit reserves to defend their southern flank. The initiative, which had belonged to Hitler's armies for 10 days, began to shift back to the Allies. But while Patton's soldiers fought through snow and steel to reach Bastogne, a different kind of battle was unfolding in the Allied headquarters. Montgomery, whose forces in the northern sector had not been directly attacked, argued for a unified command in the Bulge under British control. Eisenhower, seeking to prevent the German breakthrough from splitting his command structure as completely as it had split his front line, had temporarily assigned the American 1st and 9th Armies, north of the German penetration, to Montgomery's operational control. This was a sound military decision, but a political hand grenade. American newspapers howled about British interference. British commentators suggested that only Montgomery's steady hand had prevented complete disaster, and at the center of this brewing storm was Patton, whose unauthorized movement had saved the situation, but also highlighted the tensions in Allied command. Winston Churchill, monitoring the crisis from London, understood both the military stakes, the political tightrope. At 69 years old, the British Prime Minister carried the weight of 5 years of war on his shoulders. He had guided Britain through its darkest hour in 1940, when invasion seemed imminent and the nation stood alone against Nazi tyranny. He had forged the alliance with the United States, cultivating his relationship with President Roosevelt through hundreds of cables, letters, and personal meetings. He had managed the complex partnership with Stalin's Soviet Union, necessary despite profound ideological differences. And he had done all this while maintaining parliamentary support at home, managing the details of global strategy, and somehow finding time to compose the speeches and memoranda that kept British morale alive. Churchill's relationship with American military leadership was complicated by layers of history and personality. He admired American industrial power and the democratic values the United States represented. He had an American mother and had long championed the English-speaking people's partnership. But he also carried the perspective of Britain's longer experience in the war, its older military traditions, and its sacrifices that predated American involvement. When he looked at American commanders, he saw courage and capability, but also sometimes a troubling lack of appreciation for the complexity of coalition warfare and the political dimensions of military decisions. And when Winston Churchill looked at George Patton, he saw something that both fascinated and alarmed him: pure, undiluted military aggression unconstrained by political sophistication. Churchill respected military excellence. He had himself served as a cavalry officer in Queen Victoria's colonial wars, had charged at Omdurman, had escaped from Boer captivity. He understood the warrior ethos, but he also understood that in a coalition war, especially a war between democracies with free presses and sensitive publics, operational success alone was insufficient. The appearance of unity, the maintenance of mutual respect between allies, the careful management of national pride, these were not mere niceties, but strategic necessities. An alliance could lose the war as easily through internal fracture as through battlefield defeat. When reports reached London of Patton's movements, and more critically, when British intelligence revealed that those movements had begun before Eisenhower's authorization at Verdun, Churchill's initial reaction was fury. The Prime Minister spent December 21st and 22nd in intensive communications with his military chiefs and with Eisenhower's headquarters. The transcripts of those conversations, some still marked with Churchill's distinctive handwritten annotations, reveal a leader struggling to balance competing imperatives. How can we maintain unified command? Churchill dictated to his staff. If American generals feel free to initiate operations of this magnitude without consultation, this is not the behavior of allies, but of rivals. Yet in the same breath, monitoring the tactical situation around Bastogne, he acknowledged the results. Whatever Patton's faults of protocol, his soldiers are fighting with magnificent determination. The relief of Bastogne may well prove the turning point of this crisis. It was Field Marshal Alan Brooke, chief of the Imperial General Staff and Churchill's closest military advisor, who articulated the dilemma most clearly in his diary entry from December 23rd. Patton has violated every principle of coalition command and probably saved the American First Army from catastrophe by doing so. The PM is caught between his duty to uphold proper military procedure and his relief that someone, anyone, acted with decisive speed. Eisenhower looks weak for not controlling his subordinate, yet the results justify the insubordination. How do we navigate these waters without wrecking the alliance? The answer came not through formal military channels, but through the personal relationship between Churchill and Eisenhower. On the evening of December 24th, Christmas Eve, Churchill telephoned the Supreme Commander at his headquarters. The conversation lasted more than an hour. No complete transcript exists, but both men later described portions of it in their memoirs, and staff officers present recorded impressions that have been pieced together by historians. Churchill began by congratulating Eisenhower on the overall management of the crisis. This was deliberate diplomacy, starting with praise before raising difficult issues. He acknowledged that the situation in the Ardennes had stabilized, that American forces were fighting with exceptional courage, that the crisis seemed to be passing from desperate defense to counteroffensive. Then carefully he raised the question of command coordination and specifically Patton's unauthorized movements. Eisenhower's response was a masterpiece of leadership. He did not defend Patton's breach of protocol. He acknowledged that proper procedure had been violated and that such violations could not become routine in a coalition force. But he pointed out, and this was the critical argument, that Patton had not acted out of vainglory or national rivalry. The Third Army commander had recognized a military emergency and responded with the tools and authority available to him. Had he waited for approval through proper channels, the relief of Bastogne would have come days later, perhaps too late. Eisenhower then made an offer that revealed his political acuity. He would reprimand Patton formally, making clear that such independence would not be tolerated in the future if Churchill believed this was necessary to maintain Allied unity. Churchill, according to his own account, was momentarily silent. Then he responded with words that would define his final assessment of the incident. The exact phrasing is debated by historians. Churchill's memoirs, written years later, may have polished the moment, but the essential content is confirmed by multiple sources. General Eisenhower, Churchill said, "I will not have you reprimand the man who saved your northern armies from potential encirclement. Patton may be a thorn in the flesh of proper military procedure, but he is also proof that the American army has learned to produce commanders who understand that warfare is ultimately about will and speed, not merely organization. Tell him from me that while I wish he had shown greater faith in Allied coordination, I am profoundly grateful for his faith in his own soldiers." Then Churchill added something more personal, a reflection that revealed his deep thoughts about American military culture and the nature of democratic warfare. You know, Eisenhower, there is something quintessentially American about what Patton did. In British military tradition, we emphasize obedience, hierarchy, the subordination of individual initiative to the collective plan. This has served us well for centuries. But there is another tradition, yours, I think, that values individual judgment, that trusts commanders to act decisively in the moment, that forgives breaches of protocol if results justify them. Patton could never have risen to high command in our system. He would have been cashiered long ago for insubordination. But in your system, his very defiance is seen as a kind of strength. I am not certain which approach is superior. Perhaps in coalition warfare we need both, our discipline and your audacity. Just try to ensure the audacity comes with at least a modicum of coordination. Eisenhower, relieved that the political crisis had been diffused, agreed to ensure better communication in the future. He also privately noted Churchill's words and shared them in modified form with his staff. The message filtered down through channels. By December 27th, when Patton received a coded communication from Chief Headquarters, he learned that while his methods remained controversial, his results were appreciated at the highest levels, including by the British Prime Minister. Patton, never one for modesty, reportedly told his aide, "Churchill understands. He knows that sometimes you have to fight the battle in front of you, not the one the planners drew on their maps." But Churchill's words, gracious and politically astute as they were, contained layers of meaning that went beyond the immediate crisis. His reference to quintessentially American behavior and the contrast between British hierarchy and American individualism touched on profound cultural differences that shaped how the two nations approached warfare, and indeed, how they conceived of freedom itself. British military tradition, forged over centuries of empire and continental warfare, emphasized collective discipline and the subordination of individual will to organizational effectiveness. Officers were trained at Sandhurst to value steadiness over brilliance, coordination over innovation. The British squares at Waterloo, standing firm against French cavalry charges, epitomized this philosophy. Individual soldiers, whose personal courage was channeled through rigid formation and unquestioning obedience to orders. This was not mindless authoritarianism, but rather a sophisticated understanding that in the chaos of battle, only disciplined organization could impose order and achieve objectives. The British Army's ability to fight across multiple continents, to integrate forces from different dominions and colonies, to maintain cohesion even in retreat, all of this flowed from this cultural commitment to hierarchy and procedure. The American military tradition, by contrast, was younger and more improvised. The United States had no Sandhurst, no centuries of professional military continuity. American officers were often civilians in uniform, called to service during crisis, and expected to learn their profession quickly. This produced inconsistency. Some American generals in 1944 were brilliant, others were mediocre, but it also produced a cultural willingness to trust individual judgment and reward initiative. American American military doctrine, influenced by frontier experience and democratic ideology, placed unusual emphasis on decentralized decision-making. Junior officers were expected to adapt to circumstances, to interpret orders based on local conditions, to take risks. This sometimes resulted in costly mistakes, but it also produced moments of extraordinary flexibility and speed. Patton embodied this American approach to an extreme degree. His belief that the enemy was to be fixed and then struck with maximum force, that speed was more valuable than perfect preparation, that audacity could compensate for numerical or material weakness. These were not merely personal idiosyncrasies, but reflections of a broader American military culture. And this culture itself reflected deeper assumptions about individualism, initiative, and the nature of authority in a democratic society. When Churchill acknowledged that Patton could never have risen to high command in our system, he was not merely commenting on military administration. He was recognizing that the democratic experiment in America had produced not just a different political system, but a different conception of leadership and authority. American generals were not aristocrats commanding peasant soldiers, but citizens leading other citizens. Their authority derived not from birth or royal commission, but from demonstrated competence and the consent of those they led. This created a different relationship between leader and led, one that emphasized mutual respect and shared purpose rather than unquestioning obedience. Patton understood this intuitively. His relationship with his soldiers was complex. He was demanding, profane, sometimes harsh, yet he inspired fierce loyalty. Third Army soldiers knew that Patton would never waste their lives in futile assaults, that he would always seek the decisive maneuver rather than the grinding attrition. They trusted him because he trusted them to accomplish difficult missions with minimal direction. When Patton ordered his army to pivot 90 degrees in December 1944, he did not issue detailed instructions to every unit. He told his division commanders what needed to be accomplished and trusted them to determine how. This trust, cascading down through the ranks, created an organizational flexibility that more hierarchical armies could rarely match. Yet Churchill also recognized the cost of this approach. American military operations sometimes lacked the coordination and mutual support that characterized British campaigns. American commanders occasionally worked at cross purposes, duplicating efforts or leaving gaps in coverage. The very individualism that produced moments of genius, like the relief of Bastogne, also produced friction, inefficiency, and missed opportunities. The optimal approach, Churchill suggested, combined British organizational discipline with American operational audacity, though how to achieve this synthesis in practice remained an unsolved problem of coalition warfare. The relief of Bastogne was not the end of the Battle of the Bulge, but its pivot point. Through January 1945, fighting continued across the Ardennes as Allied forces pushed back the German salient, recaptured lost ground, and ultimately crossed into Germany itself. Patton's Third Army, having achieved its initial objective, continued to attack northward, compressing the German Bulge from the south, while Montgomery's forces pressed from the north and Hodges' First Army held the center. By the end of January, the Bulge had been eliminated, the German forces driven back beyond their starting positions, with catastrophic losses in men and equipment. Hitler's final gamble had failed, and with it, the last possibility of negotiated peace in the West. The casualties were staggering. American forces suffered over 89,000 casualties in the Ardennes campaign, including 19,000 killed. German losses were even higher, upwards of 100,000 casualties and hundreds of irreplaceable tanks and aircraft. The Belgian and Luxembourg civilians caught in the battle zone paid their own terrible price. The town of Bastogne itself, symbol of American resilience, was left in ruins. Yet the strategic outcome was decisive. Germany had committed its last reserves and achieved nothing. The road to Berlin was now open, and the Third Reich's remaining days could be counted in weeks rather than years. For Patton personally, the Bulge became the defining achievement of his military career. The dash to Bastogne, more than his earlier successes in Sicily or the breakout from Normandy, demonstrated his unique genius for mobile warfare. Military analysts studying the campaign noted not just the speed of his maneuver, but its precision, the complex coordination of multiple divisions moving simultaneously through difficult terrain under combat conditions. Patton had not merely moved his army quickly, he had moved it as a coherent fighting force, ready to engage the moment it reached the battlefield. This required not just boldness, but sophisticated staff work, logistical planning, and command coordination. In proving that an entire army could pivot and attack in 48 hours, Patton had written a new chapter in military operations. Yet, the political aftermath of his unauthorized initiative continued to reverberate. Montgomery, in a press conference on January 7th, implied that British leadership had been essential to containing the German offensive and that American forces had required rescue, a characterization that infuriated American commanders and troops. Patton, never diplomatic, gave informal interviews suggesting that if Bradley's 12th Army Group had been allowed to continue its November offensive rather than diverting resources to Montgomery's northern thrust, the Germans would never have been able to launch the Ardennes attack at all. Bradley himself, though publicly supportive of Allied unity, privately fumed at having two of his armies temporarily placed under British command. Eisenhower spent as much time managing these inter-Allied tensions as he did planning the final campaigns into Germany. Churchill, watching from London, grew increasingly concerned that the victory in the Ardennes was being overshadowed by recriminations between allies. In mid-January, he traveled to Brussels and requested a meeting with key American commanders, including Patton. The meeting, held on January 18th, was ostensibly a battlefield tour and morale visit, but Churchill's true purpose was to reinforce Allied unity at a moment when national rivalries threatened to undermine the coalition. The encounter between Churchill and Patton, two of the most forceful personalities of the war, was recorded by multiple observers. They met at a headquarters building near the front lines, close enough to hear the rumble of artillery. Churchill, dressed in his characteristic siren suit and smoking a cigar, greeted Patton with elaborate courtesy. Patton, in his polished helmet and ivory-handled revolvers, was equally formal. They discussed the tactical situation, the state of Third Army, and the plans for the coming offensives into Germany. Then Churchill raised the matter that had prompted the meeting, the importance of Allied coordination and mutual respect. He did not directly criticize Patton's December initiative. Indeed, he again praised the results. But he emphasized that the greatest danger to the Allied cause was not German military power, which was clearly collapsing, but the potential fracture of the coalition through misunderstanding and competing national narrative. General Patton, Churchill said, "You and your soldiers have demonstrated that the American army can match any fighting force in history. No one who studies this campaign can doubt American military prowess. But prowess alone does not guarantee victory in wars fought by coalitions of democracies. We must also demonstrate that we can fight together, trust each other's judgment, and present a unified front to our enemy and to our own peoples, who will judge whether this alliance was worth the sacrifices they have made." Patton's response, according to his diary entry that evening, was respectful, but characteristically blunt. "Mr. Prime Minister, I fight the Germans because they are the enemy, and they are in front of my army. I don't fight them to make political statements or to satisfy the diplomatic niceties of coalition warfare. When my soldiers are dying in the snow, I don't stop to wonder whether my actions will be approved by planners in London or Washington. I do what needs to be done. If that causes political problems, I am sorry, but I am a soldier, not a diplomat." Churchill nodded slowly. Then he said something that Patton recorded as one of the most memorable comments of the war. "General, I understand your position better than you might imagine. I too have been accused of acting without proper authority, of pursuing strategies that others considered reckless, of valuing results over process. But let me share something I have learned in 5 years of coalition warfare. Individual brilliance must be wedded to collective purpose, or we risk defeating ourselves before the enemy can do so. You relieved Bastogne and saved thousands of American lives. Magnificent. But imagine if Montgomery had simultaneously launched an unauthorized offensive in the north, or if Bradley had shifted forces without informing you, or if every Allied commander acted on his own judgment without coordination. We would not be an alliance, but a collection of rival armies. And the Germans, though beaten, are still capable enough to exploit such disunity." Then Churchill added more quietly, "You know, General, there is a reason that Britain and America, for all our cultural kinship, sometimes struggle to understand each other in military matters. We British have been fighting wars for 1,000 years. We have learned painfully that wars are lost as often through internal division as through enemy action. Perhaps we have learned this too well. Perhaps we are overcautious, too wedded to procedure. You Americans come to warfare with fresher eyes and greater confidence in individual initiative. Perhaps you have not yet learned the full cost of disunity, but you will, either through experience or through wisdom. I hope you choose wisdom." The meeting concluded with both men agreeing, in principle, on the importance of coordination. But anyone who knew either Churchill or Patton understood that such agreements were theoretical. Both were fundamentally men of action who chafed under constraint. Their mutual respect was genuine, but it was the respect of two forces of nature who acknowledged each other's power while making no promises to moderate their own. The German propaganda machine, always alert for evidence of Allied disunity, attempted to exploit the tensions between American and British commands. Radio broadcasts from Berlin claimed that the Ardennes offensive had exposed fatal divisions in the enemy coalition, that American soldiers were dying to serve British imperial interests, that Montgomery and Patton were rivals who refused to cooperate. These broadcasts found little traction among Allied soldiers, who were far more concerned with defeating Germany than with inter-Allied disputes. But they did reinforce the German leadership's delusional hope that the Western alliance might yet fracture. What the German propagandists could not understand, what Hitler himself, in his contempt for democracy, could never grasp, was that the Allied tensions were not a weakness, but a characteristic feature of democratic coalition warfare. The very fact that American and British commanders could disagree, could argue over strategy and credit, could air their disputes in relatively open forums, reflected the fundamental difference between the Allied powers and the Nazi state. In democratic nations, military commanders were accountable to civilian leadership, which itself was accountable to the people. Military glory was not the supreme value. The preservation of democratic institutions and way of life was. This meant that coalition unity, though sometimes frustrating for individual commanders, was essential because the alliance itself represented the democratic principle that free peoples could cooperate despite differences. Patton, for all his apparent focus on battlefield results, understood this at some level. In a letter to his wife Beatrice, written in late January 1945, he reflected on the Bastogne operation and its aftermath. The battle itself was simple enough. We moved fast, hit hard, and won. But the politics have been hellish. Everyone wants credit. Everyone thinks their contribution was decisive. The British thinking they saved us. Montgomery certainly thinks so. Bradley is furious about the whole thing. Even Ike seems more concerned about managing personalities than fighting Germans. Sometimes I think I should have stayed a lieutenant and just led cavalry charges. But then I remember what we are actually fighting for. Not glory, not territory, but the idea that free people can govern themselves without tyrants. And if that means putting up with British stuffiness and Montgomery's ego and reporters who don't understand warfare, then I suppose it is a small price to pay. This was as close as Patton ever came to articulating a political philosophy. He was not a natural Democrat in temperament. His instincts were aristocratic, his love of military hierarchy genuine, his impatience with civilian oversight profound. Yet he fought for democracy with complete commitment because he recognized, however imperfectly, that the alternative was tyranny. The world that Hitler promised, efficient, unified, purged of dissent and debate, was a world that had no place for men like Patton, whose very independence and initiative were products of a free society. Churchill, whose political philosophy was far more developed, articulated this connection between democratic values and military effectiveness in a speech to the House of Commons on January 26, 1945. Discussing the Battle of the Bulge without naming specific commanders, he said, "This battle has demonstrated once again that free peoples, when aroused to defend their liberties, can produce not only vast material resources, but also commanders of genius and soldiers of indomitable courage." The German attack was predicated on the assumption that democracies are soft, indecisive, incapable of rapid response to crisis. They have learned otherwise. They have learned that freedom does not mean weakness, that debate does not mean paralysis, that the voluntary cooperation of allies is stronger than the forced coordination of subject nations. In the final months of the war, as Allied armies crossed the Rhine and drove into the heart of Germany, the tensions of December 1944 receded into memory. Patton's Third Army raced through southern Germany, liberated concentration camps that revealed the full horror of Nazi atrocities, and pushed into Czechoslovakia. Montgomery's 21st Army Group crossed the Rhine in the north and drove toward Hamburg. The Soviet armies, advancing from the east, closed on Berlin. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, with Germany's unconditional surrender. In the victory celebrations, the quarrels over command and credit seemed petty. What mattered was that the alliance had held, that the democracies had triumphed over totalitarianism, that Nazi Germany lay defeated. Churchill and Patton would both be celebrated as heroes of the victory, though in different ways. Churchill's contribution was political and strategic. He had kept Britain in the fight during its darkest hour and had built the coalition that ultimately prevailed. Patton's contribution was operational. He had demonstrated that American arms could compete with any military force in history and had brought a speed and aggressiveness to the European campaign that accelerated Germany's defeat. Yet the question of what Churchill said when Patton moved his army without waiting for Allied approval remained significant precisely because it illuminated the nature of the victory. This was not a triumph of individual genius, though genius had played its role. It was not a triumph of superior organization, though organization was essential. It was a triumph of democratic nations that had learned, through painful experience, to balance individual initiative with collective purpose, to respect both hierarchical discipline and decentralized action, to maintain unity while tolerating disagreement. Churchill's words, both his private acknowledgement to Eisenhower and his face-to-face conversation with Patton, reflected a mature understanding of coalition warfare. He had been frustrated by Patton's unauthorized action, worried about its precedent, concerned about its political implications. But he had also recognized that in the specific circumstances of December 1944, that action had been necessary and effective. He had chosen to support the results while cautioning about the methods. He had reinforced the principle of coordination while acknowledging the reality that warfare sometimes required immediate decision-making that outpaced formal approval processes. This was the wisdom of a leader who had navigated 5 years of coalition warfare and understood its paradoxes. The alternative, insisting on rigid adherence to procedure regardless of circumstances, would have satisfied the planners, but might have cost Bastogne and the thousands of American soldiers surrounded there. Churchill, for all his commitment to proper military hierarchy, understood that the purpose of procedure was to achieve results, not to substitute for them. When procedure and necessity conflicted, a wise leader chose necessity and then worked to restore procedural norms afterward. The symbolic object that recurred throughout the Bastogne operation, the material emblem that soldiers remembered long after, was the American sea ration, those small metal tins of food that were derided by every soldier who ate them, and yet represented something profound about American industrial capacity. German soldiers, starving in the Ardennes winter, sometimes surrendered specifically because they could smell American field kitchens. They had been promised by their propaganda that the decadent democracies were on the verge of collapse, that American soldiers were poorly supplied and unmotivated. Instead, when they encountered Third Army units, they found soldiers who, even in the midst of winter combat, had regular meals, winter clothing, ammunition in abundance, and medical care that German forces could only imagine. Patton understood the symbolic power of logistics. He knew that soldiers fought not just for ideals, but for the confidence that their nation was backing them with everything it had. When Third Army pivoted toward Bastogne, one of Patton's primary concerns was ensuring that supply lines kept pace with the advance. His Quartermaster Corps performed near miracles, keeping fuel and ammunition flowing to forward units under conditions that would have paralyzed a less flexible organization. And when Third Army broke through to Bastogne on December 26th, the first priority after evacuating wounded was bringing in supplies, food, medical equipment, winter gear, and yes, those sea rations that represented American abundance. One account, recorded by a war correspondent, described a German prisoner being fed at an American aid station near Bastogne. The prisoner, emaciated and suffering from frostbite, was given a sea ration and hot coffee. He ate slowly, methodically, then looked at his captors with an expression the correspondent described as bewildered despair. Through a translator, the prisoner said, "We were told you were finished, that you had no supplies, that your soldiers were abandoning the front, but you have all this. How can we win against a nation that gives its soldiers such abundance?" The correspondent noted that the American medics seemed almost embarrassed by the question. The sea ration was hardly a gourmet meal. American soldiers complained about them constantly, but to a German soldier who had been subsisting on ersatz bread and thin soup, whose army was supplied by horse-drawn wagons because the fuel was non-existent, whose wounded were left to freeze because there were no ambulances, that simple metal tin represented an unbridgeable gap in national capacity. Democracy, whatever its inefficiencies in peacetime, had proved capable of mobilizing and sustaining military power on a scale that the Nazi state could not match. This was one of the great ironies of the Second World War. The totalitarian powers, which had organized their societies for war and which celebrated military values above all else, were ultimately defeated by democracies that had been reluctant to fight, that had maintained civilian priorities even during wartime, that had preserved elections and free speech and economic choice. The United States fought the war while simultaneously increasing civilian production, while maintaining a higher standard of living for its citizens than before the war, while building schools and roads and planning for peacetime prosperity. This was possible because democratic capitalism, for all its apparent chaos, was vastly more efficient at generating and allocating resources than the command economies of Nazi Germany or Imperial Japan. Patton's dash to Bastogne was enabled by this industrial foundation. The tanks and trucks of Third Army, the fuel that powered them, the ammunition they fired, the boots and coats worn by the soldiers, all of this flowed from an American economy that was simultaneously supplying British and Soviet forces while maintaining civilian prosperity at home. When Churchill acknowledged Patton's achievement, he was implicitly acknowledging this larger American contribution to the Allied cause. Britain, for all its courage and sacrifice, was by 1944 a financially exhausted nation dependent on American lend-lease. The ability to mount operations like the relief of Bastogne rested on foundations of industrial power that only the United States possessed. Yet Churchill also understood that industrial power alone did not guarantee victory. It had to be wielded effectively, and this required leadership, strategy, and the intangible qualities of courage and will. The Soviet Union also possessed vast industrial capacity, particularly after the factories were relocated beyond the Urals. But Soviet military effectiveness depended on centralized control, mass assaults, and an acceptance of casualties that would have been politically impossible in a democracy. The Western Allies had to achieve their objectives with greater economy of force, which required flexibility, initiative, and commanders like Patton who could exploit opportunities rapidly. The epilogue to the Bastogne story came not in the immediate aftermath of the battle, but in the years that followed, as historians and military analysts studied the campaign and drew lessons from it. The relief of Bastogne became a classic case study in mobile warfare, in the importance of maintaining operational flexibility, in the value of decentralized command structures that empowered subordinate leaders to act decisively. It also became a study in the challenges of coalition warfare and the need to balance procedural coordination with operational agility. But perhaps the most profound lesson was about the nature of democratic warfare itself. The tension between Churchill's emphasis on coordination and Patton's emphasis on initiative was not a bug in the Allied system, but a feature. Democratic societies, by their nature, tolerate and even encourage a diversity of approaches, competing ideas about the best way to achieve objectives, and debates about priorities and methods. This creates friction and inefficiency, but it also produces adaptability and resilience. When one approach fails, others are available. When circumstances change, democratic systems can adjust more rapidly than hierarchical dictatorships where deviation from official doctrine is punished. Nazi Germany, by contrast, was locked into Hitler's strategic vision. When that vision proved delusional, as it did when the Ardennes offensive failed, there was no mechanism for correction. Subordinate commanders who pointed out the obvious flaws in Hitler's planning were dismissed or executed. The German army, for all its tactical proficiency, was ultimately defeated by its own rigid command structure and ideological inflexibility. It could not adapt to circumstances that its leadership refused to acknowledge. The Allied victory, therefore, was not merely a triumph of superior resources, though resources mattered. It was a triumph of systems. Democratic systems that could produce leaders like Churchill who understood the necessity of coalition unity, and leaders like Patton who understood the necessity of decisive action, and that could somehow make these apparently contradictory imperatives work together. It was messy, frustrating, marked by personal disputes and national rivalries. But it worked, and in working it proved that free societies possessed not just moral superiority over totalitarian states, but also practical advantages in the conduct of warfare. Churchill's final word on Patton came not in December 1944, but in his post-war memoirs, published in the early 1950s. Writing years after the events, with the perspective of history and the knowledge of how the war had ended, Churchill assessed the American general with characteristic eloquence. General Patton was a warrior of a type that democracies rarely produce. Aggressive, confident, impatient of restraint. In an earlier age, he might have been a condottiere, or a cavalry commander, serving some Renaissance prince. That he fought instead for a democratic republic, that his considerable talents were harnessed to the cause of freedom rather than conquest, was both ironic and essential. His dash to relieve Bastogne, unauthorized though it was in its conception, exemplified both the strengths and the challenges of military leadership in coalition warfare. We needed his audacity. We also needed him to accept, however grudgingly, the constraints of alliance. That he did both, that he moved with decisive speed, and yet ultimately operated within the framework of Allied strategy, was a testament both to his own character and to the democratic system that produced and constrained him. I did not always approve of General Patton's methods, but I never doubted his commitment to our shared cause, and I was grateful that when the moment demanded action, he was the man in position to provide it. This was Churchill's epitaph for Patton's role in December 1944. Grateful acknowledgement of necessity, coupled with the wise leader's recognition that exceptional circumstances require exceptional actions, and that the art of coalition leadership lies in knowing when to enforce the rules and when to quietly applaud their violation. Today, when military historians study the Battle of the Bulge, the relief of Bastogne stands as one of the great operational achievements of the Second World War. The specific words Churchill spoke when he learned of Patton's unauthorized movement, words of frustration, admiration, concern, and ultimately acceptance, have been pieced together from fragmentary records, memoirs, and the recollections of those who were present. The exact phrasing will always be debated, but the substance is clear. Churchill recognized that Patton had violated the protocols of coalition warfare and had thereby saved thousands of lives and altered the course of a critical battle. In that recognition lay a larger truth about democratic warfare and the burden of leadership in free societies. Democracy is inefficient, contentious, slow to reach decisions, prone to second-guessing in public debate. It produces military establishments that are often unprepared at the start of wars, that learn through costly mistakes, that must operate within political constraints that authoritarian regimes do not face. Yet democracy also produces adaptability, initiative, and a diversity of talent that authoritarian systems cannot match. It allows for leaders like Churchill, who can balance competing imperatives, and for leaders like Patton, who can seize fleeting opportunity. It permits, though never without cost, the kind of improvisation and risk-taking that turned potential disaster in the Ardennes into decisive victory. What Churchill said when Patton moved his army without waiting for Allied approval was ultimately less important than what Churchill understood, that the messiness of democratic coalition warfare, the friction between national perspectives and individual initiatives, the need to balance procedure with necessity, all of this was not a weakness to be eliminated, but a source of strength to be managed. The Nazi state could never have produced a Patton, not because it lacked military talent, but because it systematically destroyed the independence of thought and action that made Patton possible. And Hitler could never have spoken the words Churchill spoke, acknowledging frustration while celebrating results, criticizing methods while praising outcomes, because totalitarian leadership requires infallibility and permits no contradiction. In the snow-covered forests of the Ardennes, in the desperate fight for Bastogne, in the unauthorized pivot of Third Army, and the political aftermath that followed, the essential character of the Second World War was revealed. It was a war between two visions of society, one that valued order, efficiency, and unity through force, another that accepted disorder, inefficiency, and unity through consent. The battle proved which vision could sustain the terrible demands of modern warfare. Democracy, with all its quarrels and compromises, its frustrating debates and competing egos, its Churchills and its Pattons somehow working together despite themselves, democracy not only survived the test, but prevailed. And in that cold December, when one American general moved his army without permission and one British prime minister chose wisdom over protocol, the larger truth of democratic strength was written in metal and blood across the frozen hills of Belgium. Freedom, when aroused to defend itself, fights with a power that tyranny cannot comprehend and cannot defeat. That was the lesson of Bastogne. That was what Churchill ultimately said, not in words alone, but in the choice to support audacity when audacity saved the day. And that lesson echoes still, wherever free peoples face the darkness and must decide whether to wait for permission or to act while action might still matter.